Professor Cartwright had set him up to fail, aiming to make an example of him in front of the entire class. But when Daniel Reed solved a problem that even graduate students struggled with, the room saw her in a completely new light. It was another typical Tuesday morning at the University of Michigan. The lecture hall buzzed with low chatter as students shuffled into their seats, flipping through dog-eared notebooks and opening their laptops, preparing for Professor Linda Cartwright's advanced calculus class. Known for its difficulty and her infamous no-nonsense approach to teaching, Cartwright commanded the room from the moment she entered, her sharp features and silver-rimmed glasses cutting a striking figure. Her gaze alone could make even the most confident students shrink into their chairs. To pass her class, you had to earn it. There were no shortcuts, no sympathy. Today she wasn't in the mood for nonsense. Striding to the front, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, she snapped a piece of chalk between her fingers. The room instantly quieted. "All right," she said, brushing a stray strand of blonde hair from her face. "Last lecture we covered multivariable limits. Today we move on to Laplace transforms." She turned to the board, her handwriting flowing neatly across the surface in intricate equations. The students scrambled to take notes, some already lost in the maze of symbols, while others pretended to understand. But Cartwright thrived in this chaos. The pressure, the competition. She knew most of them would falter, and she preferred it that way. It solidified her belief that only the truly gifted belonged in her world. In the middle of the room, one student sat quietly, seemingly unfazed by the intensity around him. Daniel Reed. Tall, lean, dressed simply in a hoodie and jeans, Daniel wasn't the type to attract attention. He wasn't struggling, nor was he panicking. In fact, he looked bored. As Cartwright wrote on the board, Daniel's sharp eyes noticed something, a small error. A minor one, but an error nonetheless. He could have ignored it. After all, no one else seemed to notice. But Daniel wasn't the type to let mistakes slide, especially when he knew it would only lead to wasted time later if the professor corrected it. Just as he was about to decide what to do, a hesitant voice broke the silence from the front row. "Professor Cartwright, I think there's an error in the second line." Cartwright turned slowly, arching an eyebrow in disbelief. "An error?" she repeated, her tone as though the mere suggestion offended her. She scanned the board and then smirked. "There is no error," she said flatly. The girl who had spoken turned crimson and quickly looked down, humiliated. Daniel exhaled in frustration. He hated this. The way some professors dismissed students without a second thought, as though they were infallible. Without thinking, his hand shot up. "Actually," Daniel said, his voice calm but unwavering, "there is an error." A ripple of surprise ran through the room, all eyes turning to him. Cartwright's expression remained stoic, but there was a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Oh?" she said, arms crossed. "Enlighten me!" Daniel stood up, not to make a spectacle, but because he preferred speaking from a standing position. "It's in the second step," he explained. "You applied the transformation to the wrong term. The coefficient doesn't carry over that way. If you solve it using your method, the final answer doesn't match the expected result." The room fell silent. Cartwright's jaw tightened. She turned back to the board and scanned her own work. There it was. The mistake. Her grip on the chalk tightened. For a moment, Daniel thought she might just admit it and move on, but instead, her lips curled into a tight smile. "Well, Mr. Reed," she said, turning to face him, "since you're so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way?" A few students chuckled under their breath. Daniel heard the unspoken message in her words. She didn't want to admit he was right. She wanted to put him on the spot, make him stumble, but that wasn't going to happen. Daniel set his notebook down and walked calmly to the front of the room. He took the chalk from her hand, feeling the weight of the room's gaze on his back, the quiet murmurs of students wondering if he was about to embarrass himself. But Daniel wasn't nervous. He stepped up to the board, and with smooth, deliberate strokes, began to solve the problem. The room waited in silence, and in that moment, everything changed. He erased the incorrect part of the equation and rewrote it with precise, deliberate strokes. His handwriting wasn't as neat as Professor Cartwright's, but that didn't matter. What mattered were the numbers, and they lined up perfectly. As he worked, his voice remained calm and casual, as though it were just another day. "The mistake is in how the transform was applied," he explained. "You carried the coefficient outside too early, which changes the integral limits. But if you solve it this way, it keeps the function intact." The room fell silent except for the soft scratch of chalk against the board. When Daniel finished, he set the chalk down and stepped back, his gaze unwavering. Professor Cartwright stood rigid, her arms crossed, her lips pressed together tightly. She wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in front of a lecture hall full of students. Daniel could see it in her eyes. She wanted to dismiss him, brush it off, maybe even twist the situation to make herself look right. But instead, she took a slow breath and nodded curtly. "Fine," she said. "You corrected it. Congratulations." Some students exchanged glances, unsure how to react. That was it. No praise, no recognition. Daniel didn't need it. He simply returned to his seat, feeling the weight of his classmates' eyes on him. Some were impressed, a few irritated, likely the ones who thought he was showing off. But Daniel wasn't showing off. He just couldn't stand errors, especially ones that could have been avoided. Cartwright turned back to the board, wiping away his work with a brisk motion. "Let's move on," she said coldly. "Since Mr. Reed is so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge." Daniel blinked. "Excuse me?" But Cartwright was already writing again. This time, it was a much longer equation, sprawling across half the board, filled with integrals, limits, and a particularly tricky differential component. She finished with a flourish and turned to face him. "Since you have such a keen eye," she said, "solve this." A few students shifted in their seats, sensing the tension. Daniel stared at the equation. He knew exactly what Cartwright was doing. She was setting him up. This wasn't a normal problem. The complexity alone told him she didn't expect him to solve it. She expected him to hesitate, to stumble, to get partway through and realize he was in over his head. She wanted to prove that he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. Daniel exhaled through his nose, his resolve solidifying. "Fine," he muttered, standing again and walking back up to the front of the room. A few students chuckled, clearly expecting him to struggle. Cartwright smirked, stepping back and folding her arms. "Take your time," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. But Daniel didn't need time. He picked up the chalk and began to write. No hesitation, no second guessing. He solved each part of the equation with smooth, deliberate strokes. Every symbol, every number flowed from his mind to his hand effortlessly. His brain was 5 steps ahead, visualizing the solution before his fingers had finished the previous line. The room grew quieter, the murmurs fading. Cartwright's smirk slowly faded as she watched him. Halfway through the equation, Daniel glanced at her. "I assume you want the solution in terms of exponentials instead of trigonometric functions." She didn't answer. He kept going, finishing the equation with a few more steps and simplifications. Then, with a flourish, he underlined the final answer and casually set the chalk back on the tray. Silence. The room was filled with a deep, consuming silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single student let out a low whistle. Cartwright's expression was unreadable as she scanned his work line by line, searching for an error. There was nothing. He had solved it, not just correctly, but elegantly. The solution was clean, efficient. A few students began whispering. Others leaned forward, clearly realizing what had just happened. Daniel crossed his arms. He wasn't smiling, wasn't gloating. He was just waiting. Professor Cartwright finally spoke, her voice tighter than before. "Lucky guess." A few students laughed under their breath, though not at Daniel. He tilted his head slightly, meeting her gaze. It wasn't a guess. Cartwright exhaled sharply through her nose. "Sit down, Mr. Reed," she muttered. Daniel turned and walked back to his seat, the energy in the room shifting with every step. He could feel it. No one was looking at Cartwright the same way they had at the start of class. He hadn't set out to embarrass her, but he wasn't about to shrink to make her comfortable either. Cartwright turned back to the board, but her grip on the chalk tightened. She continued with the lecture, but her words lacked the usual authority. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-sentence, her gaze scanning the rows of students, her eyes locked on Daniel once more. "If you're so confident, Mr. Reed." With a forced smile, Professor Cartwright leaned in and said, "How about we raise the stakes?" A ripple of nervous laughter spread across the classroom as some students leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Daniel, however, remained stoic, not reacting to the challenge. "What do you mean?" he asked calmly, the words carrying just enough curiosity to keep the room in suspense. Cartwright strode over to her desk with purpose, pulling out a thick, worn textbook. She flipped through the pages, stopping at a section far beyond the scope of what they had covered in class. Turning the book around, she showed the dense, complicated equations printed on the page for all to see. "This," she said, tapping the page dramatically, "is from an advanced graduate-level course. Something I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to be able to solve." A murmur of surprise passed through the room. Students exchanged curious glances, many uncertain of what Cartwright's intentions were, but she wasn't finished yet. "Since you seem to have a natural talent for this," she continued, her voice smooth but edged with challenge, "why don't you prove it?" Her smile was tight, almost predatory, and her eyes locked onto Daniel, daring him to accept the challenge. Daniel exhaled slowly, understanding exactly what was happening. This wasn't a test of skill anymore. It was a power play. Cartwright wasn't interested in seeing if he could solve the problem. She wanted to break him. She wanted to push him beyond his limits, make him struggle, force him to falter in front of the class, and reassert her authority. She wasn't interested in math anymore. This was about control. Daniel could feel the eyes of the students on him, the pressure mounting. Some were waiting for him to back down, to refuse. But he wasn't about to let that happen. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. For a brief moment, Cartwright's smirk wavered, as if surprised he had actually stood up to her. She handed him the textbook, but Daniel didn't even glance at it. He had already memorized the problem from the moment she turned the book around. Without a word, he picked up the chalk. He knew the game she was playing. She had done this before, pulling out problems just out of reach to humble students who thought too highly of themselves. But Cartwright had miscalculated. Daniel thrived in situations like this. He approached the board, his movements controlled, deliberate. The problem was tough, no doubt about it, but tough didn't mean impossible. As his chalk moved across the board, the whispers from the room faded into the background. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic scratch of chalk against the board. He wasn't rushing, letting each step unfold naturally, his mind already 5 steps ahead as he flowed from one equation to the next. Every simplification, every transformation was done with precision, and each move was leading him closer to the inevitable answer. Finally, with a flourish, he boxed the final result. He stepped back and turned to face the class, the room now completely silent. Cartwright's expression was unreadable, but Daniel could see the tension in her jaw, the way she held herself rigidly. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. She had hoped that this challenge would bring him down, that it would expose his limits. But instead, he had made her look foolish. In the back of the room, a student let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. Even the students who had been skeptical of Daniel's ability were now looking at him in a new light. Cartwright's hand twitched slightly at her side. She had to say something, anything, to regain control. "You've skipped a step," she said sharply, her voice tight with frustration. Daniel raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "No, I didn't." Cartwright's fingers curled at her side, and she insisted, "Yes, you did." Without missing a beat, Daniel turned back to the board and pointed to a section near the middle of the problem. "This step here where I simplified the partial fraction decomposition, that's what you're talking about." Cartwright didn't answer. Daniel simply nodded and continued, "I didn't skip it. I just did the calculation mentally because it was straightforward." The class was dead silent. Cartwright's face was tightening by the second. She could feel the shift in the room, the way the students were beginning to doubt her. Daniel turned back to her, his tone matter-of-fact. "But if you'd like, I can write it out the way you prefer." His voice wasn't cocky or challenging, it was just flat, factual, and that made it even worse. He wasn't trying to make her look bad, she was doing that to herself. Cartwright inhaled sharply, trying to maintain control of the situation. "No, that won't be necessary," she said, her voice tight, as she set the textbook down on the desk a little harder than necessary. The air in the room had changed. Daniel could feel it. He had just turned the class against her, but Cartwright wasn't about to let this end quietly. Her face composed, she turned back to the class, gripping the desk to steady herself. She was trying to figure out her next move, but Daniel knew the game was over. He had won, not with his knowledge alone, but by refusing to back down when she tried to break him. The students were still processing what had just happened. Some exchanged glances, others whispered in low voices, trying to grasp the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Then, a hand shot up from the second row. Brian, one of Cartwright's favorites. He leaned forward and asked, "Professor, if he got it right, doesn't that mean Daniel just solved a graduate-level problem? Shouldn't that, mean something?" Cartwright's lips pressed into a thin line. Brian wasn't wrong. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that she had underestimated Daniel. That would mean admitting she had been wrong. "I never said it was impossible," she responded smoothly, trying to rewrite the narrative, "only that it would be difficult for an undergraduate." There was something slippery about her response, like she was already trying to backpedal and downplay what had just happened. Daniel let out a slow breath, his gaze fixed on the desk in front of him. He wasn't looking for validation. He didn't need her approval. But the class did. They needed to see what was happening here. They needed to see who was in charge now. Another student raised their hand, his voice tentative but filled with curiosity. "So, if he got it right, does that mean he should be in a more advanced class?" Professor Cartwright didn't answer immediately. She glanced at Daniel, her eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing something. A fleeting moment passed, an internal calculation behind her gaze, before she finally gave a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I think," she said, her tone softer now, "Mr. Reed would benefit from an academic challenge." A few students perked up. Was she really recognizing his talent? Was she about to suggest he move up to a higher-level class? The murmurs spread quickly, but Daniel wasn't convinced. As if to push the idea further, Cartwright continued, "I'd like to invite him to a little competition." The room buzzed again with surprise and curiosity. Daniel frowned. "What kind of competition?" Cartwright walked over to her desk, pulling out a folder and flipped it open to scan the papers inside. "There's a university-sponsored mathematics symposium coming up next month," she explained. "Some of the best students from universities across the region will be competing. It's a rigorous, high-pressure environment, not just about solving problems, but about doing it under time constraints, with an audience." She paused and turned to face him, her eyes locking with his. "I assume you'd be up for it?" Daniel immediately understood what was happening. This wasn't an opportunity, it was a setup. Cartwright wasn't testing just his math skills anymore. She was testing his ability to handle pressure. She wanted to see if he could perform outside the safety of the classroom. If he failed, it wouldn't just be in front of his classmates. It would be in front of professors, graduate students, and some of the sharpest minds in the field. The weight of the room was palpable as everyone waited for his answer. If he backed down now, it would make it seem like his success in class was a fluke, that he wasn't as capable as everyone thought. But if he accepted, he'd have to win. There was no other option. Daniel exhaled slowly and nodded. "Once I'm in." Professor Cartwright's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Excellent," she said, her voice cool and composed. But she wasn't done with him yet. The news of the competition spread like wildfire. By the time Daniel stepped out of the lecture hall, students were already whispering about it in the hallways. A few nodded at him with newfound respect, while others looked at him with the kind of curiosity reserved for athletes about to enter a championship game, expectant, waiting to see if he could live up to the hype. Daniel didn't pay much attention. He had bigger things to focus on. The symposium was in 4 weeks, and that meant he had just 4 weeks to prepare for a competition that some people spent months, even years, training for. That night, Daniel sat in the campus library, surrounded by textbooks, notebooks filled with calculations, and a half-empty coffee cup that had long gone cold. He had always loved math, but this felt different. This wasn't just about solving equations anymore, it was personal. As he sat there, burning the midnight oil, he looked up to see Brian standing at his table, hands stuffed into his pockets. Brian shrugged and smirked. Gotta be ready. You're already ahead of half the people who compete in these things, Brian said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. Cartwright's just pissed that you embarrassed her. That's the only reason she threw you into this. Daniel leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. He had thought about that. I know. Brian studied him for a moment before asking, So why do it then? Daniel sat still for a moment considering the question. He could have walked away, let the moment pass. He didn't need to prove anything. But he also knew how people like Cartwright operated. If he backed down, she'd use it as confirmation. She'd find a way to frame it, say he was talented but not disciplined enough, intelligent but not ready for real challenges. She would make sure that's what people remembered. Daniel wasn't going to let that happen. Because she expects me to lose, he finally said, his voice steady, and I want her to be wrong. Brian's grin widened. Now that I can respect. 4 weeks later, Daniel found himself standing in a large auditorium-style lecture hall at the University of Pennsylvania. His gaze was fixed on the panel of judges sitting across the room, and above them a long digital timer counted down the minutes. Competitors sat in assigned seats, their desks filled with scratch paper and pens. The directive was simple: solve the problems faster and more accurately than everyone else. The pressure was immense, and Daniel could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Among the crowd, Daniel noticed one familiar face: Professor Cartwright. She was seated in the audience, watching him closely. Leading up to the competition, Professor Cartwright hadn't spoken to Daniel much. No words of encouragement, no advice. Just a polite nod when they arrived, as though she were a mere observer instead of the one who had thrown him into this challenge. Daniel knew exactly what she was waiting for. She wanted to see if he'd crack under the pressure. The timer began, and Daniel didn't crack. The first round was all mental math, solving complex problems without writing anything down. While some competitors hesitated, Daniel's hands moved fluidly, punching numbers into the response system faster than the proctors could even verify them. The second round tested theoretical application, requiring competitors to break down abstract concepts into proofs. This was where Daniel's natural intuition took over. To him, numbers weren't just numbers. They were patterns, rhythms, structures that built upon one another. The third round was the most challenging: speed solving. This was where many of the best students faltered. The pressure could make even the most skilled second guess themselves. But Daniel thrived under pressure. He ignored the murmurs in the room as his name steadily climbed the leaderboard. By the final round, there were only 2 competitors left in serious contention: Daniel and a PhD candidate from MIT. The last problem appeared on the screen. It was brutal: layers of integrals nested within summations. This problem wasn't just designed to test knowledge, but endurance. Daniel's pulse remained steady. He exhaled deeply, picked up his pen, and started writing. What happened next shocked everyone. As the clock ticked down, the final seconds stretched like an eternity. Daniel's fingers gripped the pen tightly, his mind processing the problem faster than he could write it down. Every part of the equation had to be perfect. No shortcuts, no miscalculations. He could hear the faint scribbling of his MIT competitor next to him. They were neck and neck, each racing to finish first. Daniel's heart pounded, but his thoughts were clear. He saw the pattern, the shortcut that no one else would notice. That was it. His hand moved faster, slashing through the numbers, simplifying the expressions in ways most students wouldn't even think of. He didn't need to double-check. He already knew the final answer. With a swift motion, he boxed the answer and set his pen down just as the timer buzzed. He looked up. His competitor was still writing. The room was dead silent. One of the judges stood up, walking over to examine both answers. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like it could be cut with a knife. After a long pause, the judge raised his microphone. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Daniel Reed. The room erupted. Some students clapped, others gasped in disbelief. But Daniel didn't react immediately. He just exhaled, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. He had won, not just against the other students, but against the expectations placed on him, against the professor who had doubted him, against all the unspoken assumptions that had tried to define him before he had the chance to define himself. Professor Cartwright stood motionless in the crowd. Daniel met her gaze for the first time. She looked unsure, like she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about him. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't scowling either. With a slow, almost imperceptible nod, she acknowledged him. Daniel didn't need an apology. He didn't need validation. He had let the numbers speak for themselves. The next morning, he walked into class and took his usual seat. Cartwright entered a few minutes later, just as composed as always. But this time, when she scanned the room, her gaze landed on him with something different: respect. She cleared her throat before addressing the class. "Before we begin today's lecture," she said, her voice even, "I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium." The room fell silent. "Daniel Reed took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country," she continued, her voice steady. "That is no small achievement." A few students clapped, and Brian shot Daniel a knowing grin. Cartwright turned back to the board, and with that said, she added, "Let's begin." That was it. No over-the-top praise, no long-winded speech, just an acknowledgement, and somehow that meant more than anything else. Because Daniel hadn't needed to prove himself to her. He had needed to prove something to himself, and he had. Sometimes the best way to change people's minds isn't through words, it's through undeniable truth. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. What would you have done in Daniel's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.